Good day, everyone. I'm Divine Ocampo, and I will be discussing the reservations of the different IP groups in the southern Philippines. Here is the topic outline of my report. The objectives of this report is to analyze the various laws and regulations that protect the rights of indigenous peoples in the Philippines, to identify and describe the reservations of different IP groups, and to highlight the significance and challenges of these reservations. Now I will discuss the major IP groups in the southern Philippines. The Lumad, an umbrella term for various indigenous groups in Mindanao, such as the Manobo, Mandaya, and Tiboli. They have a strong spiritual connection to the land and practice sustainable agriculture. Challenges include land dispossession and conflict-related displays. Next, the Tausug, indigenous Muslims from the Sulu archipelago known for their seafaring skills and vibrant boat-making tradition. Their culture is influenced by Islam, and they face issues of marginalization, poverty, and limited infrastructure. Next is the Maranao. Predominantly found around Lake Lanao, they are known for their intricate wood carvings, the Sarimanok symbol, and epic literature like the Darangin. They have been heavily impacted by conflicts such as the Marawi Siege. Next group is the Bajau, nomadic seafarers also known as sea gypsies who live on houseboats and are skilled in diving and fishing. They face marginalization and displacement from coastal areas due to development and environmental pressure. Next is the Yakan, indigenous Muslims from Basilan famous for their elaborate weaving and vibrant textiles. Their culture includes rich musical traditions and strong community bonds. Next is the Bilan. Found in South Cotabato and surrounding areas, they are known for their beadwork and sustainable farming practices. They struggle with displacement from development projects, poverty, and preserving their cultural heritage. Now let's proceed to discussing the legal framework governing IP rights and reservations. Article 12, Section 5 of the 1987 Philippine Constitution states that the state shall protect the rights of indigenous cultural communities to their ancestral lands to ensure their economic, social, and cultural well-being. This provision is part of the broader framework of the Constitution that recognizes and promotes the rights of ICCs and IPs within the Philippines. It highlights the state's obligation to safeguard the ancestral domains of these communities, which are vital for their cultural identity, social structure, and economic sustainability. Why is this section significant? First is the protection of ancestral lands. The section emphasizes the importance of ancestral lands to the identity and survival of indigenous communities. It acknowledges that these lands are not merely property, but are integral to the cultural, social, and economic fabric of indigenous societies. Second is the economic, social, and cultural well-being. By ensuring the protection of these rights, the state aims to promote the overall well-being of ICCs and IPs, allowing them to thrive economically while preserving their unique cultures and traditions. Third is the foundation for further legislation. This constitutional provision laid the groundwork for the subsequent laws, notably the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997, which further elaborates on the rights of indigenous peoples, including their rights to self-determination, free, prior, and informed consent, and the preservation of their cultural heritage. Next legal framework is the Indigenous Peoples' Rights Act of 1997. It is officially known as the Republic Act No. 8371. It is a landmark legislation in the Philippines designed to recognize and protect the rights of indigenous cultural communities and indigenous peoples. This law is significant as it provides a comprehensive framework for the empowerment, self-governance, and cultural preservation of the indigenous groups in the country. Now let's proceed to the key provisions of the IPRA. First is the recognition of the ancestral domain rights. IPRA acknowledges the rights of the ICCs and IPs to their ancestral domains, which include lands, inland waters, coastal areas, and natural resources traditionally owned or occupied by them. This recognition is crucial for the social, economic, and cultural well-being of these communities. Next is the self-governance and empowerment. The Act affirms the inherent right of the ICCs and IPs to self-governance and self-determination. It mandates the state to respect their values, practices, and institutions, thereby allowing them to pursue their own economic, social, and cultural development. Next is the free, prior, and informed consent. IPRA establishes the principle of FPIC, which requires that ICC and IPs must give their consent before any development projects that can take place in their ancestral domains. This provision aims to protect their rights against external pressures and exploitation. Next is the social justice and human rights. The Act emphasizes that ICCs and IPs are entitled to the same rights and protections as all citizens of the Philippines. It seeks to ensure that these communities are not discriminated against and have equal opportunities in various aspects of life, including education and employment. Next is the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. IPRA created the NCIP, which serves as the primary government agency responsible for implementing the provisions of the Act. The NCIP is tasked with formulating policies, plans, and programs to recognize and promote the rights of ICCs and IPs. Next legal framework is the Administrative Order Number 1 Series of 2002. It was issued by the NCIP in the Philippines to provide guidelines for reviewing and verifying certificates of ancestral domain title and certificates of ancestral land title. This order aims to streamline the process of recognizing and formalizing ancestral land claims by indigenous cultural communities and indigenous people. The key provisions of this administrative order includes purpose and scope. The order establishes a clear framework for the application, review, and issuance of CADT and CALTs, ensuring that the rights of the ICCs and IPs to their ancestral lands are respected and upheld. Next is the application process. Individuals, families, or clans belonging to the ICCs and IPs can apply for a CALT over identified ancestral lands within certified ancestral domains without undergoing the formal delineation process. For lands outside these domains, applicants must provide substantial evidence of continuous occupation and utilization. Documentation requirements. Applications must be accompanied by various forms of evidence, including written accounts of customs, historical agreements, survey plans, and testimonies from community elders. This documentation is crucial for substantiating claims of ancestral lands. Next is the review and verification. Upon receiving an application, the NCIP Service Center conducts an investigation and prepares a report detailing its findings. If the evidence is deemed sufficient, the application is forwarded to the NCIP Provincial Office for further review. Once the provincial office finds the application meritorious, it endorses the application to the NCIP Ancestral Domains Office for the issuance of the corresponding CADT or CALT. Next is the registration of titles. The NCIP is responsible for registering all issued CADTs and CALTs with the appropriate register of deeds to ensure legal recognition and protection of the ancestral land rights. Next is the reconveyance of fraudulently transferred lands. The NCIP is mandated to take legal action against illegally acquired titles and facilitate the reconveyance of ancestral lands to the rightful ICCs and IPs, ensuring that the rights of good faith possessors are protected. The last legal framework is the Executive Order Number 1 Series of 2001. It was issued by President Gloria Macapagal Arroyo to create the Office of the Presidential Advisor for Indigenous Peoples Affairs and ensure the effective implementation of the IPRA. Executive Order Number 1 Series of 2001 demonstrates the Philippine government's commitment to prioritizing the rights and welfare of IPs. By creating a dedicated office under the Office of the President, it elevates the importance of indigenous issues and ensures high-level attention and coordination for the implementation of IPRA. The order also highlights the need for a whole-of-government approach in addressing the concerns of ICCs and IPs, with the Presidential Advisor serving as the bridge between the Office of the President, government agencies, and indigenous communities. The key provisions of this executive order includes the creation of the Office of the Presidential Advisor for Indigenous Peoples Affairs. The order establishes the Office of the Presidential Advisor for Indigenous Peoples Affairs under the Office of the President. The Presidential Advisor is tasked with ensuring the effective implementation of IPRA and serving as the principal advisor to the President on matters concerning the ICCs and IPs. Next is the functions of the Presidential Advisor. It coordinates with the government agencies and other stakeholders to ensure the implementation of IPRA. It advocates for the rights and welfare of ICCs and IPs and facilitates the resolution of issues and concerns affecting ICCs and IPs. Next is the coordination with the National Commission on Indigenous Peoples. The Presidential Advisor shall work closely with the NCIP, which is the primary government agency responsible for implementing IPRA. The NCIP shall provide technical and administrative support to the Office of the Presidential Advisor. Lastly, the funding and administrative support. The order directs the Department of Budget and Management to provide the necessary funding for the operations of the Office of the Presidential Advisor. The Office of the President shall provide the necessary administrative support and facilities for the effective functioning of the Office of the Presidential Advisor. Now let's discuss the IP reservations in Southern Philippines. In the Philippines, ICCs and IPs have the right to their ancestral domains, which include lands, inland waters, coastal areas, and natural resources traditionally owned or occupied by them. These ancestral domains are not considered reservations in the strict sense, but rather recognized territories where ICCs and IPs have certain rights and privileges. However, there are some areas in southern Philippines that have been designated as reservations for specific purposes, which may include the presence of ICCs and IPs. These reservations can be broadly categorized into different types. First type is the ancestral domains. These are lands traditionally owned or occupied by indigenous peoples, recognized under the IPRA. These domains are not strictly reservations but are vital for the cultural and economic survival of indigenous communities. For example, the Monombo group. It is widespread in the provinces of Agusan del Sur and Bukidnon. They have established ancestral domains that are recognized under IPRA. Next example is the Bagobo group, primarily found in Davao del Sur. The Bagobo people have ancestral lands that are integral to their cultural practices and life. Next example is the Tiboli group, located in the South Cotabato. The Tiboli people have ancestral domains that are essential for their agricultural practices and cultural traditions. Next step of reservation are the protected areas. Certain areas in the southern Philippines are designated as protected areas which may overlap with ancestral domains. These areas are managed for conservation while recognizing the rights of indigenous communities. For example is the Mount Apo Natural Park, home to various indigenous groups including the Bagobo and Manobo tribe. This protected area is significant for biodiversity and cultural heritage. Next type of reservation are the military reservations. Some lands in southern Philippines are designated as military reservations. While these areas are primarily for military use, they may also include ancestral lands of indigenous communities. For example, the Zamboanga del Norte Military Reservation. This area may intersect with ancestral lands of the Subanon people who inhabit the Zamboanga Peninsula. Next type of reservation are the forest reservations. Forest areas in southern Philippines are classified as forest reservations managed by the Department of the Environment and Natural Resources. These reservations often overlap with the ancestral domains of various indigenous groups. For example, the Subanon group in the Zamboanga Peninsula. The Subanon people have ancestral domains that include forested areas recognized under IPRA. Next type is the community-based forest management areas. These areas are established to promote sustainable forest management while recognizing the rights of indigenous people. An example is the Mamanwa group, found in the Agusan-Surigao border region. The Mamanwa people are involved in community-based forest management initiatives that support their livelihoods and cultural practices. Now let's proceed to the cultural significance of these reservations. First is the preservation of traditions. Reservations are crucial for maintaining the cultural heritage of indigenous communities. They provide a space where traditional practices, languages, and customs can be preserved and passed down through generations. This includes rituals, ceremonies, and community gatherings that reinforce cultural identity. Next is the connection to ancestral lands. The land within reservations is often tied to the spiritual beliefs and historical narratives of indigenous peoples. These lands are seen as sacred and integral to their identity, providing a sense of belonging and continuity with their ancestors. Next are cultural centers. Many reservations establish cultural centers, museums, and educational programs that promote indigenous history and culture. These institutions serve as platforms for cultural exchange, education, and community engagement, fostering pride and awareness among both indigenous and non-indigenous populations. Next is sovereignty and self-governance. Reservations allow indigenous communities to exercise self-determination and governance. This autonomy enables them to create and enforce laws that reflect their cultural values and needs, reinforcing their identity and community cohesion. Now let's proceed to the ecological significance of these reservations. First is the biodiversity conservation. Reservations often encompass ecologically significant areas that are crucial for biodiversity. IPs possess traditional ecological knowledge that contributes to sustainable land management and conservation practices, helping to protect ecosystems and wildlife. Next is sustainable resource management. Many indigenous communities practice sustainable agriculture, forestry, and fishing, which are essential for maintaining ecological balance. Their traditional practices often prioritize the health of the environment, ensuring that natural resources are used responsibly and preserved for future generations. Next is the climate change resilience. Indigenous lands can act as critical buffers against climate change. The ecological practices of IPs such as agroforestry and rotational grazing enhance soil health and resilience, contributing to broader environmental stability and climate adaptation strategies. Lastly, the cultural landscapes. The landscapes within reservations are often shaped by the cultural practices of indigenous people. These landscapes are not just physical spaces but are imbued with cultural meaning and ecological knowledge, reflecting the relationship between the community and their environment. Let's proceed to the challenges faced by indigenous peoples' reservations in the southern Philippines. IPs in the southern Philippines face numerous challenges regarding their reservations and ancestral domains. These challenges impact their rights, livelihood, and cultural integrity. One of the challenges are the land conflicts and disputes. Land disputes often arise due to overlapping claims between indigenous communities and non-indigenous entities, including private landowners and government projects. This can lead to violent confrontations, particularly in areas like the Bangsamoro, where historical grievances and clan feuds complicate land ownership issues. Next is the fragmented land administration. The land administration system is fragmented with multiple agencies involving in issuing land tenure instruments. This complexity can lead to confusion and disputes over property rights, making it difficult for IPs to assert their claims effectively. Another challenge is the violence and displacement. Land disputes can escalate into violence, especially when armed groups become involved. For example, conflicts in areas like Upi, Maguindanao, have seen armed confrontations between different factions, putting indigenous communities at risk and leading to displacement. Clashes between military forces and armed groups such as the Bangsamoro Islamic Freedom Fighters often catch IPs in the crossfire, forcing them to evacuate and disrupting their lives and livelihoods. Another challenge is the lack of recognition and support. Although the Indigenous People Rights Act provides a legal framework for recognizing ancestral domains, the implementation is often weak. Many IPs remain unaware of their rights under IPRA, leading to challenges in asserting their claims. Next is the economic marginalization. Many indigenous communities remain economically marginalized with limited access to education, healthcare, and job opportunities. This economic disadvantage is exacerbated by insecure land tenure, which discourages investment and development within their communities. The influx of migrants and non-indigenous settlers often leads to competition for resources such as land and water, further marginalizing IPs and impacting their traditional livelihoods. Another challenge is cultural erosion. As indigenous communities face pressures from external development and modernization, there is a risk of losing traditional knowledge and practices. This cultural erosion can diminish their identity and community cohesion. Displacement due to land conflicts or development projects threatens the cultural integrity of the indigenous communities. When communities are uprooted from their ancestral lands, their connection to their cultural heritage and identity is often severed.